now we're going to move on to transitions, because you've made this wonderful point. Now you've got to make your next point, right? And if we look at Revelation, having made that point, we're actually going to go to the conclusion then. But normally, after a point, you're going to make your next point. And you need some kind of transition so that you're not just like a robot saying point 1, point 2, point 3. So we come up with a little transition that will do this. 4 things it does. They can sum up the previous point. They can connect different parts together without confusion. So if you've got a linking phrase that links in your next point, people don't get confused and think, well, what's he talking about now? Third thing they do, they can help you as a teacher to remember what you was going to say without having to memorize it. I write down in my notes my transitions. And when I see my transition, I know what I'm about to say. But I've got that transition so I don't get lost. You know that horrible thing where you're like, and you know, just like, you know, it's like, that's happened to me loads of times. So I write down my transitions. That's what I do. You might not want to do that. That's cool. But it's something I'm suggesting can be useful. Means you don't have to then memorize everything else. Now, the 4th thing they do is provide unity, order and progress. Those things we talked briefly about earlier. Transition can help unify everything together. It can help make points proceed to the next point, and it can create some kind of order. So transition points can be important. Now, we won't labour the point of transitions. We'll move into applications. Now, you South London guys know a lot about applications. There's arenas of applications. What I mean by that is areas in which you can apply applications. You've got your personal life, your home life, you've got your work life, you've got your church life, and you've got your community life. So when you're coming up with applications to tell the congregation, bear these arenas in mind. You want to give them specific applications they can use in the workplace, that they can use in the living room at home, and that they can use in the church, and that they can use out on the street in their community. Then you've got avenues, application avenues in life. Now these 7 points here, I'm sure a lot of people know these. When you're making an application, ask the question, how should the truth affect these areas? The first one is people's attitudes. Then there's people's knowledge, people's behaviour, which is kind of the more obvious one we always think of. Then you've got relationships, people's motives, people's values and people's character. If you can bear those things in mind, you come up with some good applications. I need to spend more time looking at these points when I'm making my applications. I tend to just quickly come up with something quick, write it down and say, yeah, that's good. But maybe I should spend more time reading these. So, that's applications. Now we're going to move into illustrations, because this is probably what people know least about. Illustrations. The purpose of an illustration is, guess what? To illustrate. Nothing else. Okay? But you will get tempted to use it for other things. To show people that you're funny. To show people that you know a clever story. To keep everyone laughing. Now, humour's good. Humour seems to help people last longer. You know, they get every now and then get to laugh, and then they can take another 10 minutes. So, humour's good, but remember that you're there to teach the Bible. You're there to preach the Bible, not to preach illustrations. Okay? Very unpostmodern. You all know me, I'm not a postmodern guy. We're there to preach the Bible. So, you might be thinking I'm anti-illustrations. I'm not at all. I'm just into using them right. First thing, how are we going to use an illustration? Okay, this is what you do. You make your point, like Neil made his point, his S point, right? You state your point, then you transition to an illustration. Okay, now this illustration will be a little story. Maybe you got it from that 2000 illustrations book. You can get it for free from eSword. Right? Make your illustration, and then you transition to the congregation, and then you restate your point. Now, if you can remember that formula, that will be useful, because it will help you use illustrations in the right way. My wife is much happier with me since I started doing this. Because before she used to be like, oh, he's gone on another story. Another 10 minutes and he'll still be telling the story, and you know. Whereas now I'm like, ching, ching, ching. Well, I like to think so anyway. So that's the way to do it. So make sure you restate the point at the end of it. You tell people, okay, so just in the way that little Eddie in our story did such and such, all of you guys in the church should blah, 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 and then restate your point at the end. That way the illustration will be useful. Now, good places for illustrations. The introduction can be a good place for the illustration. Also, every major point you make, talking about the big bones, but not the little bones, maybe one or two little bones, but if you make an illustration for every point, people are going to get really bored of it. Okay, you're not Jack and Ori. Right, now, the place where you use the illustrations is in your E point. You know, save a point. When you get to E, when you explain it, that is the ideal place to use illustrations. You don't have to teach like say your S and then say your A and say your V and say your E. I do, but what you could do is write them all down and then work out a way to fit all of those together into one paragraph. You could do that, but because I like to waffle, I stick to just, so in my mind I'm like, what am I on? I'm on V. Okay, this is important because, and then I'm like, what am I on now? I'm on E. Okay, now what I mean by this, and then I tell my illustration, and that just helps me stay on track. So, when you do an illustration, these are the questions to ask, yeah? Because you'll read these illustration books and you'll be like, what a good illustration, but it's not always going to be appropriate. First question is, what illustration will be an additional explanation of the point? Okay, what illustration can I give that will actually add to the explanation I've just given them of my point? You probably think that's kind of obvious, and it is. Next one is, what illustration will help them see truth in my point? Sometimes you can find an illustration that you think will explain the point, but when you ask yourself this question, you realise it won't help them see the truth in your point. It could be because your illustration's too wacky. I've come up with a few, and I've got loads of videotapes, if anyone wants to see them, of how not to do a gospel night, where you come up with illustrations that young Michael Radford just, you know, I'm telling him, well, you're going down to A3 and there's no brakes, and you're like, brother, and straight away he's like, oh no, you know what I do? Yeah, I do. And then he starts going off on one about all these Action Man things he do, and you're like, that illustration didn't work. It didn't help him see the truth from what I'm saying. It just, you know. Right, the other thing is, what illustration will help them apply it to their own life? So the story I'm going to tell them, is it going to help them apply this to their own life, or is it just going to take up 5 minutes of the teaching? So these are the questions to ask in the illustration. Now, we're pretty much home free now. Going to sum up with the conclusion. Okay? The conclusion is going to review the main point of your sermon. Okay? It's also going to invite the audience to obedience. So we're not going to make it just a technical sermon, we're going to invite them to obey at the end. And at the end of it, the congregation should feel like they've reached their destination. In the intro, you told them that you were going to let them see such and such a thing. Hopefully, in the conclusion, they're going to see, aha, we've arrived. Okay? Now, things you mustn't do in the conclusions. Multiple conclusions. Right? This could be like your airplane's going to land, and it lands, and you're like, oh, thank goodness we didn't crash. And then it bounces back up again, and then it lands again, and then it bounces out, and it keeps doing that, and you're like, when are we going to land finally? Okay, don't do that to your congregation. Land and stay on the ground. Right. Now, the other thing is, don't introduce fresh ideas in the conclusion. Don't just suddenly be like, and another thing, and then bring out something completely new. You know, it's a waste of 8 hours of preparation doing this to suddenly do that. Right, okay, the next thing, don't give a conclusion that was already given in the lesson. Now, you might think that contradicts what I said earlier, but you can give the conclusions bit by bit as you're going for each point. But I guess the idea is, at the end, you want to give them some kind of summary that, although it doesn't contain new information, it suddenly binds everything together in a way that they can take it, put it in their pocket and take it home and live it out. So if it's something that if it's the same sentence you've been hammering home all the way through the study, then it's not like a proper landing. They already know that. Okay, here's a list of skillful conclusions. Sorry, a list of things that skillful conclusions involve. It's at the bottom of page 10 probably. First thing, a clear statement of the main point of the lesson. You should be able to remind them of that. The second thing is a summarization of the main points. I love doing that with my PowerPoint, put up a list. Then you've got, third thing, applications and implications. With personal strategies for obedience. You can tell I didn't write this sentence. Got it out of a book. Applications and implications, how they can actually live it. The fourth thing, a single sentence affirmation of the truth. Just one sentence that kind of sums up the truth. Could be your main point of the text there. And the fifth thing, a final story that illustrates the main point of the lesson. If you can find an illustration that sums it all up, that could be useful. But don't just use an illustration for the sake of it. Right. This checklist now that I've got contains some new information, but it's stuff that you can all handle. What I do, I quickly read through it. If you have a question about any of the points, just holler, and then we cover that question. But I'm thinking we can just read through it and then we'll finish up today so people can get away who need to. Right, this is a checklist. I'd encourage you to keep this, and when you're doing your Bible study, check through it. I do. It can be humbling sometimes as well, because you realise that you've done something wrong and you're like, I can't really make a clear case from the Bible about this, but it would have sounded really good, but I can't. Okay, first thing is looking at the accuracy to the biblical text. Okay, first question is the main point I gave the text accurate and adequate? Remember those two questions, accurate and adequate. The next thing is, based on the main point of the text, what does God want these people to know and obey? Okay. Third thing, does my lesson objective achieve this? Fourth thing, is my lesson objective truly based on the main point of the text? I could have worded that as saying, is my purpose bridge truly based on the main point of the text? And then finally, can I defend this biblically? Now, just with that bit there, you can make banging Bible studies. Just on that, because they will be biblical. That's very crucial. Next thing is your purpose bridge. When you write down your purpose bridge, right next to it, so what and now what? And then answer those questions. The so what is explaining to them why is it important for them to know it. And the now what is saying to them, this is what you do now. So whenever someone leaves one of your Bible studies, they should be able to say, right, now I know what I've got to do. They should be able to say that. 3, designing the lesson. Okay? At this point, you've got to ask yourself, what's the main point of my lesson based on the purpose bridge? Then you've got to say, have I personalised it and make it contemporary so that people remember it? Then you structure the lesson, and remember the structure of the lesson doesn't have to be the same as the text, but it probably is going to be the same structure. Ask yourself, why would people have difficulty in believing or understanding the main point of the lesson? And then ask yourself, how can I design a lesson so that people are impacted by the main point of this lesson? Have I catered for the I don't knows and the I don't believes? And is there unity to my different points? Have I got the right proportion for each different part? And do the points progress the lesson? Have I saved a point? S-A-V-E-A-P. Have I done that with each of my points? And have I included transitions? Then you've got the applications, right? Now the 3 important things here is after the service, or after the Bible study, whatever it is, they should remember what you've talked about. Okay? Sounds obvious, but a lot of time people don't. Okay? Now, this should be answered by stating the lesson objective and the body of your sermon. So at the beginning of your sermon, you tell them the objective, or you tell them what your purpose bridge is. Now don't say to them, by the way guys, this is the purpose bridge, because no one's going to know what you're talking about. But say, the purpose of this teaching today is that blah blah blah, or by the end of today you're going to know how to blah blah blah. And then in the body of your sermon you'll be talking about that, which means afterwards when someone says, what did you do in church today? They can say, we learned how to overcome temptation using the Bible as a weapon. That kind of thing. Right? The next thing they need to know is they need to understand the difference it makes for them. A lot of people leave church services not knowing the difference it makes for them. Now the solution here is to state this in the lesson objective and to give them applications. So when you're telling them the lesson objective, sorry I should say the purpose bridge, that should show them the difference it makes for them. That shows them why they should be sitting there. And the third thing they need to know is, what do they need to do now? And obviously that is answered in the applications. the applications and the conclusion, they should understand what they need to do now. Now, if you remember, illustrations, when you're doing a checklist of your illustrations, ask yourself, do they actually help people to see truth in my points? The other thing is, do my illustrations show them what to do in their own lives? If they don't, throw that illustration out. I know it's hard because you bought that book for £20 and it said it would help you be a great teacher. But if it doesn't fit this checklist, chuck it out. Right, then you've got your conclusion. Ask yourself, have I reviewed the main point of the lesson? Have I invited everyone to obey God's truth here? And have I let the congregation feel that they've arrived at their destination? And then finally, your personal life. Have I lived out this Bible study this week? If you haven't, do some weeping and mourning before you teach it. Get right with God before you teach it. Don't be a Pharisee. Now, you might be thinking, do we do this after we've taught the Bible study? What I'm going to propose to you is you do this checklist when you've written the Bible study. Please try writing the Bible study. Write it all out. Reason why, once you've written it out, you'll be able to say it much better. Anyone ever had the privilege of teaching a Bible study and then a little time later teaching the same Bible study? No. Then you find the second time much easier. You know what you're talking about. Because you've already taught it. It's like, if you remember at the YIP, teaching logic. And you've been teaching it a few times, it's easy, man. It's like someone says to you, explain Daniel's 70th week, and the first time you're like, blah, 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 blah. And then when you've actually like written it down, then you're like, bam. More times when we do a Bible study, we've just articulated the stuff in our brains. We've never said it to anyone. And we come to teach it, and we get tongue-tied. But if you've already written it down, you're going to be able to say it. The other thing is, when you die, people can publish it, and you'll be like Charles Spurgeon. All of your sermons, you see. No, but seriously, you can give them to people. Someone says, I couldn't take any notes. You can say, here you go. Or download them from the website. Or you can refer to them later. Or you can read them. You know what I do? When I've got breaks at work, I pull out my Bible study I've already written down. And I sit there and I read them. And then when I come to teach it, it's all fresh in my mind. If you find you can't write out the whole thing, at least have this whole structure thing written down. So you've got it. So what I do, I write it all out, and then I go through my checklist, and if I see some things that are off, I correct them. But if you've done your homework, there won't be things that are off. That's why you don't want to make shortcuts. So I apologise for the really rushing this last section.